Good.
Okay, well, listen, gang, we're down to our next to last week of our session, and I'm really going to miss it. I've really enjoyed this, and I learned so much myself circling back around these topics. Next week is our last one. I did put my email in the chat, so if you have any topic or any question you would like me to cover next week, just shoot me an email, and I'll incorporate that into my talk. But next week, we'll be trying to sum up what is the popular history and what is the popular future of the Episcopal Church. But today, I thought we would take a different approach. Rather than taking a period in time, we're going to look at 5 famous Episcopal churches in our country. Now, if you're going to try to narrow it down to 5, it's going to be a tough job. That means you're going to leave a lot of incredibly interesting places out of the talk. The ones that made the semifinals but didn't make the final list would be the church at Jamestown, which was the first church in the English Americas. And there's a brick tower there that's still standing that was built over 350 years ago. Now in America, 350 years is a lot of white people history. And so that's worth a visit just on its own. Plus, they've done so much new archaeology there that it's a fascinating stop. The other one I wanted to maybe talk about, but I chose not to, was the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the largest cathedral on earth. It was begun in 1892 based on a Romanesque plan. And then after a few years, it morphed into a neo-Gothic structure. And so it has a really interesting architectural history as well as a very famous cultural history. One church I wanted to call to everybody's attention is All Saints Pasadena. This is an Episcopal church that's got a long history. It's really one of our most progressive churches, but it's also one of our largest churches. Or I could have focused on St. Martin's in Houston. That was a church that was started as a suburban church in 1952 and is now the largest Episcopal church in the country, with over 9,000 members, and that's where George H.W. Bush and Barbara had their membership. I would have loved to talk about Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. It's really like a sister church to our own cathedral, with the exception that they were wealthy enough to actually finish their building after they began it. I could have looked at Epiphany Parish itself. Our own chapel is on the historic register. And our church, with its campus, really is a prime example of what was called the institutional church, especially after they added the school in the 50s. And really, if you look around our area, there aren't that many Episcopal parishes that would really qualify as institutional churches, and Epiphany is one. I tried to get us up to that scale when I was the rector at St. Andrews in Green Lake, and both St. Andrews in Green Lake and Epiphany were started around the same time for the same reason, to become an Episcopal church for a brand new emerging neighborhood in the city of Seattle. I could have done a cautionary tale about Old St. George's Church up in Lake City. It was built with just the chapel and what was going to be a grand church up there, and it never quite made it, and now it sits abandoned. They've actually tried to sell it for development, but they've run into problems. And there'll be a sad day when the diocese allows the Seattle Fire Department to burn the church down as a practice fire sometime in the next year or two. All right, those are churches that didn't make it. So the 5 that I've chosen, and while I'm talking about these 5, I'm going to start doing what's called screen sharing, where I'm going to be putting up on your screen some pictures of these churches. So the 5 that made the cut are Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, Virginia, Trinity Wall Street in New York City, Trinity Church Copley Square in Boston, the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and then our own St. Mark's Cathedral. So now let me see if the technology works, and I'll show you a picture of Bruton Parish. So I've chosen Bruton Parish, and can everybody see the picture okay? Sort of wave your hand if you can see the picture. Okay. I chose Bruton Parish because it was a key church in the establishment of the Commonwealth of Virginia and the establishment of the town of Williamsburg. The church was begun in 1674 on what was at that time called Middle Plantation. And two leaders in the area, Dr. John Potts and Colonel John Page, went to work to build this church up to be the beautiful church that it is today. John Potts donated 1,200 acres to plot out the city. John Page helped build the church and then also helped build William and Mary College in that town. So by the turn of the 17th century, Williamsburg had become the colonial capital of Virginia. They built this church building that you see here in 1715. So it's really an incredible example of the kind of churches we were talking about a few sessions ago. It's an impeccably restored model of what we identified in a lecture recently as a marriage of Christianity and classical thought, the architectural incarnation of the hopes of Christians of the moderate Enlightenment. So this is the interior of the church. And I want you to notice two things when we talk, well, three things when we talk about the moderate Enlightenment. On your right, you see a very tall, prominent pulpit. In the center is about the smallest altar I've ever seen in a church of this size. And streaming through the windows is that beautiful, clear white light. No mysterious stained glass windows, no arching ceiling, but a flat ceiling. So all of this, a prominent pulpit, here, I'll even show you the pulpit here. A prominent pulpit, a small altar, and clear light. Those are all examples of the age of reason written in stone at Bruton Parish. Well, during the Revolution, the British troops threatened Williamsburg, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the colonial governor, took everybody lock, stock, and barrel and went to Richmond. And in doing so, Williamsburg was abandoned as the colonial capital, and Richmond became the first state capital of Virginia. And really, Williamsburg became a sleepy college town for the next 120 years. And that was until Dr. Goodwin became their rector in 1903. In the meantime, this church had been carved up into Sunday school rooms. New entrances had been broken through the wall. It was really an architectural mess. And immediately after he became the rector, he went to work to totally restore Bruton Parish, and they finished the restoration just in time for the 300th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown. So in 1907, the church was restored. Well, he then spent the next 20 years of his life convincing people that Williamsburg should be restored in its entirety. And luckily, he got the ear of a particular gentleman, J.D. Rockefeller Jr., who did for over 100 structures in Williamsburg what Dr. Goodwin had done for Bruton Parish. So many of you, I'm sure, have visited Williamsburg. And if you've visited Williamsburg, you've probably visited Bruton Parish. Well, a friend of mine is the rector, had been the rector there, Holly Hollerith, and he told a funny story about a group of tourists coming in right in the middle of a service and whispering very loudly. They even do a reenactment of the church services here. Look at those ancient costumes those people have on. Well, he was simply wearing a cassock and surplice and stole. And that was what was considered the reenactment of Christian worship from the 1700s. And if you go to Bruton Parish, you can buy a souvenir. Okay, so our next building that I want to look at is Trinity Wall Street. I would probably say this image makes this the most famous Episcopal church in the United States. This image of a beautiful high steepled church right at the end of Wall Street is an image I imagine many of you had seen. It wasn't long after the Dutch had been sort of thrown off the island and threw in the towel that the Anglicans decided to build a first church on Manhattan. And the land was granted in 1697 by the colonial governor, and William Vesey became their first rector and served for 49 years. During that time, Queen Anne, who had taken the throne after William and Mary, donated 215 acres of Lower Manhattan to Trinity Parish. And that real estate is still what provides most of this church's incredible wealth, making it the richest congregation in the Episcopal Church. Now we're looking at a church that's very different than Bruton Parish. You see, we've now moved into a neo-Gothic style, where rationalism is not the key, instead high emotion, almost a romantic approach to religion, with the vaulted ceilings that want to take you soaring, with that incredible stone altar, and then a pulpit off to the left that's almost an afterthought. So this building is the third building for Trinity Church. The first building was burnt to the ground during a fire during 1776. Not many people were sad to see it go who were true patriots, because its rector and its congregation were all loyalist, royalists, and many of them after the revolution or during fled to Nova Scotia. So these elements of design are exactly the opposite. And this is really a beautiful example of that neo-Gothic structure that really became the model for so many Episcopal churches across the United States from the 1840s till the 1890s. Even in small towns, you'll see a Gothic structure for the Episcopal Church. And when I say it's a grand example, I mean it. Trinity Church was the tallest building in the United States of America for its first 25 years after it was built. So you see here, this is Trinity Church in the old days of Wall Street. So you can see with its towering steeple, how it would serve as a beacon in the midst of that. And then this is that incredibly famous graveyard that they have on both sides. And you just see how that city then, as New York began to grow around it, the skyscrapers became the cathedrals rather than the church. Okay, so now we're going to move to our third church. This is Trinity Parish on Copley Square in Boston. We see a very different style church here. This church was built by Philip Brooks, probably the most famous Episcopal priest in the late 1800s. He was called to be the rector of Trinity Copley Square in 1869 at the age of 34, and 4 years later, his church burned to the ground. And he enlisted the up-and-coming architect Henry Hobson Richardson. And he designed an entirely different kind of church than the one we saw at Trinity Wall Street. Rather than that neo-Gothic with a sanctuary that I describe as a Boeing 747, with that center aisle and that long run all the way up to a stone altar, Phillips Brooks wanted a room that was much more intimate and allowed the congregation to come together. Here's Trinity back in its old days. And then this is how Trinity sits in the city of Boston today. But when you get to the interior, you're seeing a whole different plan. This is now what we call the Romanesque or Byzantine style of architecture. It looks very Byzantine with all these colored walls. But what you notice is the transepts have been opened up so the congregation can almost sit in a circle. And again, the pulpit has become the most important piece of furniture. And that's because we had in that pulpit the most famous preacher of his day, Phillips Brooks. Phillips Brooks was the epitome of the broad church rector. And beginning this church in the 1870s and building it out through the time he became the Bishop of Massachusetts, it became the classic model of a broad church plant. The idea was that it wouldn't just be a sanctuary, but it would have a community center and a community hall, and would have lots of different programs going on. And so Phillips Brooks built this church to his particular beliefs and styles, and it remains a beautiful example of that. Here's the statue of Phillips Brooks that sits outside that church. And if you get a close-up, you can see he's getting a vote of confidence from Jesus himself for the kind of preaching he's able to do. Okay, so now we move on to our fourth church, the National Cathedral. Again, I hope many of you have been able to visit this beautiful, beautiful structure. It's an incredibly monumental example of neo-Gothic, actually Gothic architecture. It's the third largest church in the United States. It's the fourth tallest structure in Washington, D.C., and the top of its central tower is the highest point in the District of Columbia. In 1792, Pierre L'Enfant's plan of the federal city specified a site for a great church for national purposes. However, he defined it as what was going to be a non-sectarian and non-denominational church, and that didn't work so well for the good Anglican Alexander Hamilton, who was in charge of putting in place L'Enfant's plan. So he put a big X through the place for that national church building and retooled the design. That national church, if we'd have used L'Enfant's plan, would have been right where the National Portrait Gallery is, which is only about 4 or 5 blocks off of the mall. Instead, it wasn't until 1893 on January 6th that Congress passed a resolution that granted a charter to the Protestant Episcopal Cathedral Foundation that said this said corporation is hereby empowered to establish and maintain within the District of Columbia a cathedral and institutions of learning for the promotion of religion and education and charity. Do you need any more proof that by 1893, the Episcopal Church had become the establishment church of the United States of America? Then Congress entrusted to us the building of what was going to be a national cathedral. So many of you, I'm sure, have been there. You've seen the beautiful entryway. And I don't know if you've ever noticed the detail over the entryway, but look at this piece of sculpture that is carved into the entryway of the National Cathedral. Keanu Reeves was in a famous movie called The Devil's Apprentice with Al Pacino playing Satan. And they used this image, having it come to life during the movie, and were sued for damages by the National Cathedral because the church in no way wanted its edifice identified with a movie that was about Satan. So you get inside this church, and even more than Trinity Wall Street, because of the scale, you see what Gothic architecture was trying to accomplish, trying to take you to an incredibly transcendent space for worshiping God. And so the National Cathedral over time has become truly that, a national cathedral. Either state funerals or memorial services have been held for Calvin Coolidge, Warren G. Harding, William Howard Taft, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and even Richard Nixon. The cornerstone for this church was laid on September 29th, 1907, and our old famous fat cat, J.P. Morgan, was in attendance for the laying of that cornerstone. He was on his way to Richmond for that general convention we talked about last week, that he had to leave abruptly with his train and race back to New York City to save the economy during the panic of 1907. It was begun in 1907, and George H.W. Bush was there for the completion of what was called the final finial. They put the final stone on the church in 1990. You'll remember too, it was heavily damaged in an earthquake, but they finished the reconstruction. Pertinent to the kind of times we're living in now, in June of 2016, a 5-person task force recommended to the bishop and the dean that 2 Confederate battle flag images in windows honoring Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson be taken out. Those windows had actually been installed only in 1953 after a great lobbying effort by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And so on September 6, 2017, the cathedral, in a statement signed by the Right Reverend Mary Ann Buddy, our bishop in in Washington, and Bishop Randy Hollerith, Dean Hollerith, announced that they would deconsecrate and remove those windows. Now, just some of the beautiful aspects of this beautiful church. The pulpit is carved out of stones that were donated from Canterbury Cathedral, and the Glastonbury Abbey donated the stone for the bishop's seat. And the high altar is made out of stone quarried at what's called Solomon's Quarry in Jerusalem. And there's 10 red stones in front of the Jerusalem altar to represent the 10 commandments. And those were donated from the Chapel of Moses on Mount Sinai. If you've ever been there, you also know there's incredible artwork all the way through. And there's over 200 stained glass windows. And this is probably the most famous. This is called the space window. And it honors humankind's landing on the moon. And right in the middle of that window, in that circle, within that red circle, is an actual piece of moon rock that came back on Apollo 11 and was donated to the church on the 5th anniversary of Apollo 11's flight on July 21st, 1974. Well, like any good neo-Gothic cathedral or old Gothic cathedral, you got to have a lot of gargoyles around, and some of them are just so funny and fascinating. And that's because every once in a while the cathedral has a contest and allows people to submit their ideas for what should be gargoyles included on the National Cathedral. And one of the newest, and I think one of the ones that people get out their binoculars to see, is a Darth Vader gargoyle that is up high on the northwest of the 2 towers. Okay, can anybody recognize that church? Now that is, again, a very Gothic cathedral. Look at the spires, look at that central tower. Well, that was the original design for St. Mark's Cathedral here in Seattle. This was going to be what they were going to build on Capitol Hill. St. Mark's as a parish had been, St. Mark's as a parish had been founded in 1889. It was founded down right about where the Bon Marché is, where the Macy's is, down near Stewart and 5th in 1889. But it grew so fast that they bought land up on South Capitol Hill, where the Central Community College is now. And they built a beautiful church there in 1896. And then after World War I, when Seattle was really feeling its oats, if you've ever studied the history of Seattle, from the time the very first boat came to port with the gold from the gold rush in Alaska until the market crash in 1929, Seattle was a boom town. We put the cut through. We lowered the water level in Lake Washington. We sluiced down Denny Hill to create the Denny regrade. And both the Episcopal Church and the community had decided we're going to build the biggest Gothic cathedral west of the Mississippi on that prominent point up on top of Capitol Hill. So they bought the land in 1923. Bishop Houston designated St. Mark's as the cathedral. And then in 1926, he also made John McLaughlin their rector, the first dean. They collected the pledges for what was going to be called the Peace Cathedral or the Victory Cathedral. It was going to mark the end of the war to end all wars. Well, they collected all those pledges. They broke ground. And again, they were going to build that church that we saw in these structures, that this was their idea of what they were going to be building. Well, 1929 was not a good year to start building a Gothic cathedral that was going to have, that central tower was going to be 270 feet high. If you've stood in St. Mark's and looked at those 4 pillars, they're 90 feet high. So it was going to be 2 times higher than the ceiling of St. Mark's. Well, instead, the pledges didn't come through, the money didn't add up, and all we got was the poured cement interior nave of what was eventually going to be a grand cathedral. Let me come back to these. This was the St. Mark's Cathedral as they were pouring the cement for it. This was the largest concrete pour in history at its time. It was very soon eclipsed by the pouring of the Grand Coulee Dam. But that was all we got. That cement box was the only thing that we really got. And then they paid money to have a temporary copper lid put on it. And that became St. Mark's Cathedral that we knew as the Holy Box. Well, it turned out that we couldn't even maintain that. We paid our mortgage as long as we could, but finally in 1941, the bankers who held the note in St. Louis foreclosed on the cathedral, kicked the church out, and there's a famous photograph of a big "for rent" sign right in front of what was St. Mark's Cathedral. Well, luckily the church had a spare church, St. Barnabas. Now, St. Barnabas had been built in the first decade of the 1900s as what was called a chapel of ease. When you had a very rich congregation and you didn't want them to have to travel down to the south end of Capitol Hill where all the riffraff were, you would build them their own little chapel. And so we built St. Barnabas Church as a chapel of ease. And so when we got kicked out, they started worshiping at it. That's actually now a private home owned by my dear friend, Susan Payne. Olson Sundberg did a full renovation of it. It's really a classic. But that was where St. Mark's worshiped beginning in 1941. Well, somebody didn't buy the church, but somebody did rent it. In 1943, the U.S. Army Air Corps rented St. Mark's Cathedral to establish a training for anti-aircraft Army guys. And if you go down in the basement, down in the catacombs of the church, there are still murals on the wall that were drawn by all these Army guys in what was used during the time as their canteen. Now, I mentioned a chapel of ease. Probably the most famous chapel of ease that we have in the Seattle area is the chapel in the Highlands up in Shoreline. If you've ever visited up there, it is just the most precious postage stamp of a 17th century English country church. That was a chapel of ease built for the newly developing Highlands region up there. Okay, well, we're now at the end of World War II. it's sort of an embarrassment that this cathedral is abandoned up on Capitol Hill. So Emil Sick, who ran the Rainier Brewery, and Dave Beck, the infamous Teamster boss, hosted a luncheon at the Four Seasons and raised $85,000 and bought back the note from the St. Louis bankers and helped Dean McLaughlin and the bishop to move back into the church. And they burned the mortgage on Palm Sunday in 1947. Okay, well, since that time, yes, Barbara, you turn on your mic, turn off your mic. Yeah, hit your mute.
It's pronounced Emil. His name was Emil.
Oh, Emil, okay.
And he owned the brewery.
Yes.
And Mr. Dave Beck organized all of his beer truck drivers. So they were essentially in business together, because the beer truck drivers always collected the money from the tavern owners. That was how that partnership, it was called the Olympic Hotel then, but it's Emil Sick.
Thank you very much.
And that's how he roped Dave Beck into helping raise money.
Thank you for that. Well, like I said, since that time, there have been 5 different master plans for St. Mark's Cathedral. And as I said, when they did the master plan at the time of the Flintrop organ, they were going to brick the entire building. It was going to be a red brick building. In the 50s, they designed a church that it sort of emulated a little bit St. Joseph's Catholic Church on Capitol Hill. It looked like a church that George Jetson could have worshiped in. And then finally, we get the church that we have today. I'm going to have to go back in my screen to show you a couple pictures here. Let's see. Let's see if I can do it. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Hang on just a second. Okay, let me get back to where I wanted to be. Okay, share. And then we'll go back to this picture. Okay, if you've not been by, this is what St. Mark's Cathedral looks like today in what is considered a finished form. For the very first time in 2018, they completed a plan that finally enclosed the exterior structure of the entire church. This used to look like this. This is probably what many of you think of when you have driven by or been to St. Mark's Cathedral. Again, you see that hideous red brick that was going to be part of the plan. But now they finally have completed the exterior. But what's so fascinating about it and what I love is very little of the lines that you see were ever drawn by an architect. The structure that you see was the internal foundation for what was going to be that grand Gothic cathedral. As you look at it, it looks really like a Byzantine church in some ways, but that's entirely accidental. And so then when you get to the, there was the big cement pour. And then when you get inside now, they've moved from pews to cathedral seating that allows them to make multiple uses of the interior. In 1997, they put in that big, beautiful glass reredos by an artist named Ed Carpenter. They've installed these windows on the side that, again, are one of my favorite features. They look just like the old glass windows used to look. But instead, these are highly tempered, really high-tech windows for noise and for heating. And they were done by French stained glass artists who installed those beautiful windows. And then probably something many of you have not seen is the brand new baptismal font that's been established at St. Mark's. This was done by a gift from the True family, Ruth and Bill True, who were part of the Wright family. And it consists of a beautiful marble stanch with running water, but then is this sarcophagus in which they can do baptisms by immersion. And it's obviously meant to signify a grave and coming up out of the grave. It's really a stunning piece and obviously very controversial for a number of people. So St. Mark's, how could there be a more beautifully positioned church building to appear to be a beacon of light to a city it's called to serve? And St. Mark's Cathedral, since its founding, has really taken its commitment to the community really seriously, and has always become a place where the community gathers in times of loss and times of pain. After the Alaska Airlines crash, we hosted a service. After Princess Diana, we hosted a service. So really, it's really so well cited. But like any of our churches, it's had its own struggles too, and its own conflicts as it tries to live into its mission. It's also the case, as I love to quote one of my old favorite curmudgeons. I used to be on staff there for 8 years, so I love St. Mark's. One of my favorite old curmudgeons, a retired LSU professor named Nick Canada, once said, "St. Mark's was built on a bluff, and it has been operating on that principle ever since." Okay, so we've come to the end of our time here, and sorry, I could keep going, and this one went pretty long today, but I hope you're finding it fun and interesting, and we can turn on our mics, and any questions or comments anybody has, feel free to weigh in on the conversation. Just be sure to unmute yourself before you talk.
Peter?
Yes?
Hi. Thank you. When you mentioned St. Barnabas, the Chapel of Ease,
Yes.
and then you mentioned something about Seattle, I'm familiar with St. Barnabas on Bainbridge Island. So when you mentioned it, unfortunately, I immediately thought you meant the one on Bainbridge Island, and that's a long way to go. So would you please say where that Chapel of Ease was?
Yeah, if you want to drive by it, it's 1932 Federal Avenue East.
Right.
Oh, thank you. And is it still operating, or?
No, it's a private home.
Oh,
The cathedral sold it off, and there was a family that bought it that built boats in it. And they would take the entire front of the church off when they would get done building the boat and then take it out. But then Olson Sundberg did a really incredible redesign, and it's just a glorious home. My friend Susan Payne, who's a member at the cathedral, lives there.
Oh.
And it's well worth a drive by for sure. It still looks like a church, just a very small one. St. Barnabas on Bainbridge is a beautiful Gothic. You know, for a small church, they wanted to emulate that same, soaring worship and stained glass and that feel, very different than the Age of Reason kind of church that really Grace Church more represents. Well, Grace Church is a modern church, but so if you go to Bainbridge Island, you see two very different Episcopal church structures for sure.
Right.
Thank
That
you.
was, I believe, organized by Vincent Gowan, who was a professor of Oriental Studies at the University of Washington and had been in the Far East as a missionary. And so there's Gowan Way, but I mean, I believe that he organized that parish, and it was very small in the 50s, but obviously Bainbridge has changed.
Yes.
Oh, St. Mark's.
Is St. Mark's?
There was an architect named Rich Cardwell who I believe is responsible for that reredos and the external transformation on the city side. But I think that's right. But
well, we did the west wall of the cathedral in 1997, and that's when we put in the reredos and the big rose window. Had we not done that, that entire wall would have collapsed on Ash Wednesday 2001. So we finished it in 1998, and then 3 years later, that earthquake would have demolished that side of the cathedral.
And of course, it did dreadful damage to Trinity downtown, which has been remarkably resurrected, if we can say that.
Yeah.
That was a big job. Yeah.
Could you tell, is there anything that's improved now at St. Mark's with the sound? Because when I had a memorial for my husband, and I do remember, so I actually experienced the difficulty with the echo, and that I had to tell everybody speaking that they'd have to say a sentence and then stop until the echo came back and then go on to the next. And it was very challenging. What's happened since?
Well, that's a fascinating story. Yeah, there is a 6-second echo, which for music is fabulous and speaking is terrible. A man named Roger Sherman, who's been a longtime member of the cathedral and a Microsoft guy and a great, he loves the cathedral. He had been Microsoft and he was a real techie, and he still is. He got an Australian company to design a one-off proprietary sound system that the Australians swore would solve the problem. It didn't. It didn't work. And instead, when we first opened in 1999, it was really very difficult. And then another great man of our church, Glenn White, who again, he was a techie guy and loved organs. I saw him walk in there one day with a bag from Radio Shack, and he went up and he retooled the hardware part of it and got it to where it actually sounded much, much better. And then Steve Thomason, our new dean, finally, as part of this remodel, had the sound system redone. So it's much better than it used to be. A lot of it was to get excellent microphones for everybody, just like you guys, like we're getting with those directional mics. But it's still a hard room because it's an echo chamber, which is great for the music. So.
The pews, the center section pews have been removed or at least stored away someplace.
Yeah.
Is that a permanent?
Yes, they have a mix now of cathedral seating and pew seating. They wanted to do that because of so many different ways to use the space. It was interesting. They did a poll about whether they should remove them or not. One of the strongest resistances to removing the pews came from young families because they wanted to be able to move into the pew and have the kids on the floor with their crayons and one next to mom or one next to dad. Whereas with cathedral seating, the 7-year-old would have to sit in their own chair, the 4-year-old would have to sit. And so that's what led to the compromise of leaving some pews on the sides, but having seating up the middle.
Thank you.
Peter,
Well, go ahead.
Peter, one of the things you forgot to say about Roger Sherman was that he is a fine organist, and he is also has the organ loft on the show on King FM, which is absolutely fantastic. But Roger knows music as well as his tech.
I know. He would do performances for Cathedral Associates there. And I think that organ loft program is part of what we were talking about earlier, became this sort of galvanizing place for, so much organ appreciation in the Northwest.
Yeah, he also has a house on Orcas Island and he's got his own plane and runway.
And he's probably got an organ in that house.
I'm sure, yes, he's building a new place. Last time I talked to him, he was building a new home up on Orcas.
Well, listen, folks, we're going to wrap up for today. I put my email in the chat. If you've never used chat before, it's down there at the bottom of your screen. And if you punch on that, you'll see a few notices. And one of them is my email, pstrimer@comcast.net. Send along any ideas and suggestions you have. And we'll wrap up our last class on a popular history of the Episcopal Church next Sunday. So I look forward to seeing you all then. So, all right, take care.